Ladies and gentlemen, I am your host, your Imperator, your first citizen, TsarOctavian. This week is the start of something special. I've had this series planned in my mind before I even revived this channel. This new show is to cover the rich history of professional wrestling, geared towards non-fans, new fans, and those a little less knowledgeable about the history of this great sport. In the real world, I am the nephew of a professional wrestler who wrestled for both Fritz von Erich in Dallas and Joe Blanchard in San Antonio, as well as three of my own cousins were in the business at the same time. I've been a diehard fan since 2009, so about 16 years of just culminating knowledge in this brain of mine. Amongst my friends, they also regard me as a human pro wrestling encyclopedia, and now it's time to put that knowledge to use. This is the history of professional wrestling. Cutting through the history of amateur wrestling, going straight into the beef. More exactly, straight into the carnival. Needs work. But anyways, during the start of the 1800s, French carnivals, which were massively popular at the time, were always looking for the next big sideshow. Began to bring in amateur wrestling. Mostly having jacked men, or as jacked as you could be before, prayers and vitamins, who on top of looking like French Adonises, were actually trained amateur wrestlers. The men who would run these wrestling shows often went out into crowds to advertise their show. These men became known as promoters. We also get another term from these men, as they would watch their buddies' games, which were oftentimes rigged, to see who was spending the most money. The promoter would sneak up using a marker. The promoter would mark their coat. During the show, the promoter would look for the marked man and then would invite him to try and out-wrestle his strongman, which is where the term mark originated from. With wrestling taking the French circus by storm, wrestling itself would begin to spread throughout Europe. In England and France, wrestling holds beneath the waist were banned, creating what would be referred to as flat hand wrestling. Throughout the rest of Europe, they would adopt Greco-Roman wrestling. Paul Pons would be the very first pro wrestling champion as the European Greco-Roman champion. Back in the United Kingdom, promoter Charles B. Cochran had a massive star on his hands, both literally and figuratively. An Estonian Greco-Roman wrestler, Estonia, which was part of Russia at the time, the Estonian would defeat British wrestler and current European Greco-Roman champion Tom Cannon for the title. That Estonian was the Russian Lion, George Hackenschmidt. If I were not President of the United States, I would like to be George Hackenschmidt. Theodore Roosevelt. With pro wrestling exploding in popularity in the United States, Charles B. Cochran would take his biggest star, George Hackenschmidt, across the pond. Shortly after his arrival, Hackenschmidt would win the American Heavyweight Wrestling Championship. With 2 wrestling championship belts, an idea was made. What if we went the boxing route? Surely this would result in even more tickets being sold. And so by merging the European Greco-Roman Championship with the American Heavyweight title, George Hackenschmidt would become the very first World Heavyweight Champion in the sport of professional wrestling. In the United States, professional wrestling became far more dependent on storytelling, pomp, and circumstance. Hackenschmidt would struggle initially adjusting to this new American style. At the behest of Cochran, Hackenschmidt would learn from the man he beat for the European title, Tom Cannon, with Hackenschmidt at the forefront, utilizing catch as catch can, with a showman-like flair. This would be the foundation of professional wrestling for the next 120 years. However, Hackenschmidt's dominating 3-year undefeated hold on professional wrestling would soon be challenged by a young wrestler out of Iowa. That young man was the champion of Klondike, Frank Gotch. Widely regarded as one of the greatest and arguably one of the most important feuds in professional wrestling history, leading into their big match, Hackenschmidt may have let the fame and success he had rightfully earned go to his head. While lacking in technique and most importantly endurance, the Russian Lion would make up for his weaknesses by being freakishly strong for the time period. An example was when, during a match with the terrible Turk Madarali, Hackenschmidt would apply his infamous bear hug, then would throw Madarali down, dislocating Madarali's shoulder. However, as I mentioned before, with the success of being undefeated world champion, Hackenschmidt felt as though he no longer had to train, outside of a long walk here and there, despite the Chicago Athletic Club making arrangements to the champion's liking. His opponent, however, was technically sound, physically fit, and worst of all for Hackenschmidt, Gotch was hungry, and willing to do whatever it took to earn the World's Heavyweight Championship. In their match, Gotch showed off his speed, his technique, as well as fighting dirty, thumbing and headbutting Hackenschmidt until he was a bloody mess, and would continue to bully the older Lion around the ring for the next 2 hours. I would also like to note that the article that I am reading accuses Gotch of throwing Hackenschmidt down, and I shit you not, quote, proceeded to ride him hard for 3 minutes. Any future journalists out there that may be watching or listening, let this be a lesson for you. Keep slaying out your writing. Otherwise, 120 years later, people reading your work will come out traumatized, just like I did when I read Gotch riding Hackenschmidt hard for 3 minutes. By the end of the fall, beaten down, bloodied, and exhausted, the Russian Lion would forfeit his world title to Gotch. And while Gotch would return for the second fall, George Hackenschmidt would not, making Frank Gotch the second world champion in professional wrestling history. After undergoing treatment and even resorting to surgery on his knee, for the next 3 years, Hackenschmidt only had one thing on his mind: training, getting healthy, so at long last he could challenge and defeat the dirty American who stole his rightful world championship and embarrassed him on the world stage. In 1911, it was time for the Russian Lion to once again take his place as the focal point of professional wrestling. Cosmic Key Park, Chicago. 30,000 sold out, drawing a gate of $87,000, or $2.8 million in today's money. Gotch versus Hackenschmidt 2 was set. However, there would be no vengeance for the Russian Lion. You see, while rehabbing and training for his big comeback, Hackenschmidt's training partner would accidentally re-injure Hackenschmidt's surgically repaired knee. Too stubborn to call off what he deemed to be his revenge, Hackenschmidt would press forward with the rematch. Gotch was not going to give up his world title without a fight, and taking Hackenschmidt very seriously, Gotch would quickly recognize Hackenschmidt was not wrestling at 100%. As soon as he realized Hackenschmidt's knee was still injured, Gotch would jump on it. For 20 agonizing minutes, Gotch would repeatedly go to the knee, and Hackenschmidt would lose fall after fall. The Russian Lion was defeated and ultimately retired. Wrestling's first world champion would go on to live a long and fruitful career outside of the squared circle before passing away February 19th, 1968, at the age of 90. His opponent, Frank Gotch, would continue on as one of the longest reigning world champions in the sport of professional wrestling, a massive star throughout the United States, even having the honor of meeting Theodore Roosevelt whilst he was still president. His championship reign would last from 1908 until his sudden retirement in 1913. After a year of what was believed to be untreated syphilis, Frank Gotch would pass away in 1917. He was only 39 years old. During the reigns of Hackenschmidt and Gotch, professional wrestling would continue to spread throughout the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Down in Mexico, pro wrestling would take on the name Lucha Libre. But before I get ahead of myself, I wish to clarify that one day I will get to covering Lucha Libre and its rich history, eventually Japan, Europe, and Canada too. But for right now, I'm going to cover history of professional wrestling in the United States. So bear with me if you're more interested in the international scene. Following Gotch's retirement, professional wrestling would take a downturn in popularity. It still had a few stars here and there in guys like Stanislaus Zbyszko, Joe Stecher, and Earl Caddock, the later of whom was actually trained by Frank Gotch and Martin Farmer Burns. I do want to pause and back up. I'd be remiss to not acknowledge that I had not brought up the Farmer before. The man who trained the legendary Frank Gotch was one of America's earliest professional wrestlers when the sport was just gaining a foothold across the pond. He was an American heavyweight champion, the same belt later unified under Hackenschmidt. Yet his greatest accomplishment, arguably, were the students he had: Frank Gotch, the aforementioned Earl Caddock, and a promoter and shoot wrestler, Toots Mont. Martin Farmer Burns had a legendary feud with another catch-as-catch-can wrestler in Yvonne, the Strangler, Lewis. So legendary, in fact, it inspired a young man from the great state of Wisconsin to change his name to pay tribute to Lewis, and after an infamous tour of Europe, striking fear throughout the continent with his dreaded sleeper hold, Ed Strangler Lewis would return to the United States to become one of its biggest stars. Before my aside in recognizing the importance of Martin Burns, I mentioned that pro wrestling was on a downturn. Aside from the two biggest stars in the business retiring way too young, the one other factor was that matches were going on for way too long. In the newspaper, Ed Lewis vs. Joe Stecher was regarded as one of the most boring matches of all time, lasting 5 hours and ending in a draw. Imagine being in the audience for that match. So, Ed Strangler Lewis with his manager, Billy Sandow, alongside Toots Mont, would form the Gold Dust Trio. Running their own shows, Lewis was the top star, while Mont and Sandow handled the business end of things. First order of business was innovating American wrestling by adding body slams, suplexes, arm drags, and now you can punch your opponent in the face, as well as matches were shorter and had predetermined finishes. This was to keep the world champion safe and obviously be able to make more money with the champion, who was usually Ed Lewis. Then came having clear-cut characters, good guys versus bad guys. Behind the scenes, they would use terms babyface or face to refer to the good guys and heels for the bad guys. Not saying wrestling invented these terms, as both had been fairly popular slang in the 20th century, but that is the context in pro wrestling. Anyways, this style of wrestling really started taking off and making a lot of money. An added benefit to not having 5-hour matches is that now you can add more wrestlers to your roster, being able to constantly rotate new opponents for the champion as well. New names to advertise to new audiences. If you didn't like watching Lewis, Zbyszko, Mont, or Stecher, you still had the rest of the show with the other wrestlers, or, simply put, a card. With matches being predetermined, another innovation came with feuds, or in wrestling terms, programs. With Lewis at the top of the card, he'd be asked from time to time to drop the belt, as a way to raise the stock of other wrestlers. Lewis was fine with this, of course. If he really wanted the belt back, he knew full well he could take it at any moment, and what were Mont and Sandow going to do about it? During Lewis's peak popularity came arguably his most successful and iconic feud, which means, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to talk about the Golden Greek, Jim Londos. Born in Argos, Greece, but eventually making his way to San Francisco, California as an adult, Londos had quite the uphill battle trying to make it as a professional wrestler. various name changes, taking work where and when he could, constantly being put down for standing at 5'8" and being too Greek for an American audience to get behind. It was almost laughable when he would be facing off against top guys like Joe Stetcher and Dick Schickett. Don't look at me, that was his name, and he was German for the record. Anyways, after a trip back to Greece, an outpour of support from the people of his home country, this would light the fire under his ass that Jim Londos desperately needed. This new Londos would start drawing in massive crowds, especially thanks to his signature airplane spin, an eye-catching finish or finisher, which became an exciting way to end his matches and sent audiences home thrilled. All this popularity would see Jim Londos earn the World Heavyweight Championship. And Londos was a workhorse champion, defending his title 130 times a year. This would see Londos enter a Cold War-esque feud with Ed Lewis, constantly trash-talking from both sides, though neither would wrestle each other from 1924 through 1934. Now that is long-term storytelling. Londos would even see himself being screwed out of his world title. Despite having his shoulder up, which would normally disturb a pin, the referee would count the 1, 2, 3. Londos would lose the belt to Joe Savoldi, who, wouldn't you know it, was trained by Ed Lewis. In 1934 at Wrigley Field, Chicago, Londos would get his match against the Strangler. 35,000 fans and a gate of $96,000, or $2.3 million in today's money. One of the most profitable wrestling shows of all time. Londos would not just face off against his rival, but would come out victorious, pinning Ed Lewis clean as a whistle. After finally besting his longtime adversary, Londos would continue to be a top draw, and eventually was treated to a nice long vacation. The Golden Greek had been working almost non-stop, and throughout 1936 through 1937, Londos had stepped away from the sport. Inadvertently, however, this break would tank professional wrestling in the States. During that time period, only 4 shows would bring in a gate of 10,000 plus fans. Upon his return, Londos, alongside partner John Contos, would start their own promotion in Phoenix, Arizona. While not regularly competing, and certainly not at the same bonkers schedule he had before, Londos would occasionally wrestle for his own promotion, facing the future stars of the 40s and 50s, before he himself would finally retire in 1956. Londos would continue to live a long life before passing away August 19th, 1975, at the age of 81. As for his rival Ed Lewis, well, we're not done talking about him just yet. In the 1930s, Ed Lewis would begin to assist in the training of a second-generation amateur wrestler, a 17-year-old boy that had been trained by other amateur wrestlers, George Tragos and Ad Santel, a boy that Lewis would describe as smooth as a panther and exceptionally fast. Next time, we begin to talk about one of the most influential and important figures in the sport of professional wrestling, a man who became one of the biggest stars not just in the US, but all over the world. In the next episode, we will begin to talk about the life and career of Lou Thesz. Have a blessed Sunday, and Gloria Romay.